So welcome again to all. It's wonderful to have such a fantastic turnout. And especially a big warm welcome to Louise Porteus. Louise, she's an Australian urban planner by background, and she actually graduated from the DPU in 1996. So she was in your shoes a long time ago, and since she has had this amazing breadth of experience working in a range of international projects. And so she's here to share this 30 years experience with us and the work she has done in over 45 countries. And I think it's fantastic. We've already had Louise last year, and the fact that she's gracing us with all her time and attention is really fantastic. So Louise, thank you so much for agreeing to come. And please, if you can give us a short introduction and then tell us a little bit about your own trajectory, your own career trajectory, and also how you've navigated that.
Okay, thanks very much, Rita. Thank you, everyone. I don't know if it's good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, but it's really nice to talk to you all. Last year I spoke in person, and I was saying to Rita, I actually gave sweets to those who asked questions. Unfortunately, I can't do that this year, but should I get a chance to meet you, and we can meet in person, I will give you a sweet as a reward for asking a good question. Okay, so Rita's already given you an outline of my background and my number of years of experience, and I hope you're thinking, gosh, she doesn't look that old, despite my lockdown hairdo. But I just thought it would be a good chance to talk to you about sort of how I got into development and at different turning points in my career that helped me have a career that I suppose when I was at the DPU, I dreamed of having and was able to make that a reality. As you can probably hear from my twang, I am from Australia originally. I've been out of Australia for about 30 years, but somehow haven't got rid of the accent. I studied town planning because at high school I was interested in history and geography, and I wanted to make the link between those two. And fortunately, from the time I was going to university in the early 80s, town planning in Australia, which I got interested in, was very much along the lines of the early days of looking at town planning from an environment, more sustainability perspective, which now we would think is just, par for course. But back then it was really early days. So I really enjoyed seeing that link between planning and environment, which for Australia has been a very important thing. As a lot of Australians did, including me in the 80s and 90s, we were able to come over and work in the UK. So I was able to do that. And I came over to the UK and said I was an environmental planner, and everybody's going, what? What's that? And I thought at some point they're going to understand what I do. And now, that's a normal path, of course. So I worked in local government in Australia. I worked in an area in Western Sydney that was very ethnically diverse. I had a lot of refugees coming in. So that already got me interested in different cultures. And in the UK, I worked for local government in the London Borough of Camden and used that to learn the UK planning system. Whilst in the UK, I was living in a university residential hall, not studying, and there was a guy there that was setting up an NGO to look at establishing a marine reserve in Belize in Central America. And I thought, gosh, that sounds really interesting. That sounds like fun. And managed to sort of talk him into sort of giving me a job working on this marine reserve. I had to learn to scuba dive in the UK. But it was another one of those turning points of getting over there and working there and seeing what a difference different concepts could make to what was happening there. With the marine reserve is up and running and very successful. But I was advising government on how they could ask tourism operated developers to provide sewage treatment works and deal with waste, which the government at the time there didn't think about doing. So that really got me thinking about, is there a way I could do planning for developing countries? Went back to Australia and got back into planning and doing more environment work, but got a bit restless back there. and thought about what I could do about linking those. And so in 94, 95, I started looking around, and you have to remember that internet wasn't big then, but I had heard about the Bartlett, got in contact with them, got a package of information about the DPU, called a guy called Julio Davila, which I think you all know now, who interviewed me and said, Louise, pop in for a chat. And I'm like, it's midnight in Sydney in Australia. But for me, doing the masters at the DPU was a step change for me to be able to get some qualifications in development and help me crystallize ideas that I'd seen from traveling and working, setting up a marine reserve in a developing country. Despite being promised jobs by companies in Australia afterwards, that didn't quite happen, but I stayed in Australia and chipped away, got back into planning, which I wasn't all that happy about at local government, but got into planning on regeneration, which provided me with a skill that I was able to use wherever I was in the world. And I started to look at engineering companies that were doing work in developing countries and managed to get a job with one and a work permit. And stayed with them for 10 years, and it opened up the whole world for me. And I'm still very grateful to those guys. So I managed to work in doing more planning projects, but some of them are sort of more fundamental planning projects, where working in Yemen, where I was working in Aden in Yemen about doing a development program with massive rural to urban migration because of poverty and water issues. And a lot of squatting and informal land use activity that we were trying to formalize, and then just decided to use infrastructure to try and attract people into the safest areas and away from coastal areas that were suffering from erosion. So I was able to link some work from my planning with my environmental interest and do work on World Bank projects. So from that, you know, I was able then to also use some of the DPU lecturers in some of the projects that I was working on. We did some work in the Caribbean on country poverty assessments with the Caribbean Development Bank. And I got some of the lecturers at the DPU at the time, Sheila Meikle, who's well and truly retired, to come over and be part of our team on projects there. So what I found was once I got one project, usually through an engineering sort of remit, for projects on the World Bank or the Asian Development Bank or the Caribbean Development Bank, that then opened up my opportunities for other projects with those organizations, but generally through private sector, generally through engineering companies based in Britain, because I had a very good footprint in the world, linkages with a lot of old colonial countries doing engineering projects there in the past. And I found that advantageous. So once I managed to break into that sector, then I found more and more work came my way on those types of projects. So that was a turning point in getting some work with an engineering company that did international work. That turning point took more of a role working for private sector organizations, either through engineering companies or directly, with the Equator Principles that came into place in 2006. I'm not sure if you're familiar with that. That was an initiative from the World Bank to put more emphasis on private sector companies working in developing countries to take more responsibility for development. And since about 2008, I've been primarily working on projects that have an Equator Principle remit. So it's about using the IFC, the International Finance Corporation's environment and social sustainability guidelines to set up development and then monitor development. So I've been working on infrastructure projects, on natural resource projects, mining, oil and gas, pipeline, electricity projects that have a development finance institution remit, where we're looking at putting more of a development focus on how the project's set up in the first place and how it's run. So at the moment, I'm currently the environment and social manager for a startup gold mine company in Nigeria. And if you'd asked me 5 years ago, would I be here? I would have said no, but I'm so glad I am, because I'm actually working with a client. I'm really enjoying it, of taking those IFC performance standards and operating them in real life, working with the development proponents to actually involve the community in how the project's developed. We've signed community development agreements with the 3 communities that have the traditional land holdings in the area where the mine is. And that's offered job opportunities. It's offered development programs. We've just currently got underway scholarships to keep children in school for those communities. There's some things to help with school buildings, etc. It's really quite good to move beyond just a physical thing to actually provide development programs in the communities themselves. And it's also been good to see the empowerment that it gives those communities to feel that they can decide on some of the development programs themselves, and see that it's not just about an individual getting a benefit, but community benefits. We gave them a development fund for them to decide what to do, because normally they get a homage payment for people from Africa. They probably understand what that concept means. And I have to say, I was a little bit worried we'd see the chief turn up with a SUV, but we didn't. We set up community development committees around that. And they spent the money on things like putting in solar lighting for the communities. They put in, the youth built a roundabout because they were worried about traffic accidents. One of them used it on drainage. I mean, it's a really good, it was a really good lesson in seeing what communities can do if you empower them to do that and allow some community governance things to come into place. So one of the things that I thought, one of the themes that I wanted to put into your discussions, in the discussions today, is that I think sometimes we do development studies and we look at them and we think we could work with the World Bank or the UN or an NGO or charity of some description. And we don't think about some of the wider development opportunities that are out there. Certainly in the development finance institutions, there's a strong demand at the moment for people with sort of social development skills. The ESG, environment and social governance knowledge is very much in demand at the moment, because that's stopping a lot of projects moving forward. It's community stopping them rather than a technical reason. So that's something worth thinking about. There's still a lot of organizations that get involved in implementing projects, engineering. They can be engineering projects, they can be project management companies. And I think we need to be a bit wary of some of those that are more project management than have the skills in-house. There's still other organizations that are looking for people that have been at the coalface, so to speak, and worked in development, whether that be voluntarily and got some experience to work there. Certainly I know VSO in the UK is a good organization if you don't have a lot of development experience, to try and get on one of their projects, because they link with DFID before DFID disappears. So there's very much a development focus. And I know I've given that advice to some people coming through who want to get in development, and they've done that and then found doors open to them with Red Cross, other organizations that are happy that they've got some development experience. I'm not sure, because I can't see everybody's name on there. I'm not sure if Khaled is on the list there from Sudan. I can't see everybody on my list.
No, he's not here.
Oh, that's a shame, because I know Khaled. I work with him in Sudan on a dam project, and Khaled worked. He's an architect by background and worked for the dams implementation unit, and it was a government organization, but they got together a group of doers who could deliver things. And Khaled then went on to work for the Islamic Development Bank. And so he's a really good example of not coming from a traditional way of getting into development. And also another example that I was going to give you, Rita and I were discussing before about, I've come across people from the DPU when I've worked in all the different countries that might be working for government. And because they're bright and studied in development, they're often part of the government team that's involved in implementing or managing the World Bank funding or other funding, Asian Development Bank, Caribbean Development funding to make something happen. So there's an opportunity to work in your own country, but also look for those sorts of projects that come up and put your hand up to be involved in those, because that's also a good stepping stone for your career. Sorry, I've jumped around a bit, but I just wanted to give it a theme that for me, starting from a planner in Australia, having the opportunity to work in Belize, and then sort of working out some engineering firms in the UK that did international work, I've been able to have a very interesting career working across 45, I think it's nearly 50 countries now, which I've absolutely found amazing and interesting and learned from everyone. And I haven't done that through the World Bank route or the UN route, or, well, I've started with an NGO, but I've also worked in government and been able to combine that experience that you get and take that into a career. So sometimes we don't get what we want first time about the first step on the ladder outside of once you're finished doing this master's or start on your career. But if you can see that that could lead you in development, don't be too put off by that. I went back into local government working for the London Borough of Greenwich for about a year, but I was able to use that time to find out what I could use in how I could search other organizations that I thought could use my skills. And with me, the career, the knowledge of regeneration, of combining public, private, and government sectors to actually make something happen. So I'm not sure where some of you are in your career. I was a bit older when I started at the DPU, but I think there is a career out there, even if the first rung on the ladder or the first step in the labyrinth isn't quite what you think, but garner that information and use it to crisscross your way through, and you will get there. And I hope I can show you that in my interesting career, that's possible to start from that point and look at other sectors to provide that opportunity for you. Okay, so any question?
Thank you, Louise. I think what's fantastic every time I hear you speaking is that in a way you went into a sector which was not intended, say, engineering. You didn't come from engineering, yet not many people look beyond their disciplines and beyond what they studied. And I think here you are a fantastic example that shows us that, that risk taking and being adventurous to really look beyond the obvious is actually quite productive, because especially I'm seeing it right now when I'm working with people from completely outside my discipline, they value what I bring to the table because I'm so different from them, So in that sense, it's quite interesting to be able to look beyond the obvious usual suspects if you can. I have questions. So Emily, go ahead if you can unmute.
Hiya. Thank you so much, Louise, for this presentation. I just wanted to ask, in the development world, organizations such as the World Bank are heavily critiqued in a lot of ways. Yeah. I was just wondering whether you had, from an insider experience, whether you had any opinion on where places are coming from, and whether you preferred working more with NGOs or places that weren't the World Bank, etc. Thank you.
Yeah. Okay, thanks, Emily. I actually haven't worked, I've worked for the World Bank on their projects, not actually within the World Bank. But there's been a change in what the World Bank did. They used to get involved heavily in infrastructure projects. And to be honest, that's one of the reasons they were heavily criticized, because they bring in expensive solutions, lots of international teams, not enough emphasis put on local training up of local people, empowering, skills upgrading. And I think the World Bank then decided to change with those equator principles. So they're more on the policy, some emergency things, and sort of setting in train more, working with governments to instigate change. And certainly I was just thinking earlier that I have 3 friends that have sort of taken the same route as me and working in engineering companies or environment companies and are now working with the World Bank. And they're more on programs rather than projects. And I have to say, from my perspective, I've worked on some of those programs, which I found interesting. But I was working on a project in St. Lucia. I know you keep thinking I only work in hot, sunny, lovely tourist locations, which I have managed to do. But I was working on a project with the Caribbean Development Bank, which gets funding from the World Bank, on a flood mitigation study. And I was walking around with some of the guys from the village, and they were telling me where the flooding was, etc. And it hit me that these people with regard to poverty actually got a more understood something that had a direct impact on their life than a policy that we might be doing about what we should do with water management. I'm not saying that they're not important, but it was one of those turning points for me going, this is probably why I like working with engineering companies, because there's a practical solution to it. So for me, I have to say, I've enjoyed working more in the private sector and with organizations that can actually make a difference in the communities that they're working in than I have on some of those World Bank projects. As interesting as they were, I found that working even with some of the natural resource companies, because they've got to live and work there, that I've found a better influence, because you're also influencing the organization you're with, as well as the communities that they're going in. So often I talk about, a lot of what I do is above and beyond, say, a mining project. And I know mining's come in for a lot of bad press in lots of cases, rightly so. But there is a step change to change that. And I think from my point of view, the infrastructure that goes with that, the jobs creation, the more sustainable approach, as well as environmental improvements and environmental management that needs to take on board. For me, I find it a bit more holistic. It's not to say that the World Bank doesn't do good projects. And I am very grateful that the World Bank introduced the Equator Principles, forcing private sector companies to take on a development role in a more coherent way. And that, I think, is one of the best steps that they've taken, because even some of the bigger private companies that aren't after development finance, which the Equator Principles are geared to, have taken on the IFC performance standards with regard to environment and social sustainability. And 5 of the 8 performance standards are about social, which I think is interesting. So it's a good question, Emily, but that's why I think you need to think a bit wider, because there's a lot of private sector companies that are really seriously growing their ESG teams, their social teams, because they realize that's one of the biggest things that is an impact. And they're engineers, and not that I want to diss the engineers, but they're not necessarily the best communicators in the world. They do great things. I always say, engineers tell me that they save more lives than doctors can. And they always puff up their chest when I say that. So if there's any engineers out there, please puff up your chest and think that. I hope that answers the question, Emily.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Louise. Let's say Consolata, you have your hand up.
Yes, thank you very much. So obviously you're a few years on from when you started your career, and you talked about the different experiences you've had. My question is about how much of a forward plan did you have, or did you also let serendipity and a sense of, I guess, wonder and fun as you approached your different career moves? And was that also shaped by your life experiences at the time? I asked that considering as a woman, you know, if you're thinking about family and all that kind of other stuff.
That's true. I suppose it does. I mean, I keep saying, I think the thing is, I couldn't rely on luck. And given that I'm from Australia and I was working in England, I didn't have a network either of people. So, and I suppose it was, I had decided after that experience in Belize to go, to go into, when I went back to Australia, and really thought about what I wanted to do. And I'll be honest, I was going through a divorce. And so I had to think about what I wanted to do. And so I really thought about, well, I would like to do development. How do I get into that? So it wasn't an immediate thought, but then once I made that decision, things started to follow suit. It wasn't the timing that I wanted at all. I had to do things I didn't really, I felt like I took a step backwards. And after I finished the DPU course, I was promised a job by this company, international company that was based in Australia. I ended up working in a pub. But I thought, no, I want to stay in the UK, and I'm determined because I think I have a better opportunity in the UK to work in development than if I went back to Australia. I'm glad I worked in that pub because I decided, no, I've really got to do something more than that. And what I did was, because it was 1996, 97, I couldn't afford a laptop. I mean, I know it's probably hard for you to imagine, but we didn't have a lot of internet. And through the DPU, I was able to book to come on to a laptop at the DPU. I booked in Tuesday nights and Saturday afternoons. So I'd go in there and apply for jobs. I applied for 70 jobs, okay? Well, after the pub and working as a planner. And then I decided, right, why don't I just apply for those companies that I know that work internationally? And then I took a day off working as a planner, a flexi leave, and went and had interviews with 3 of them, and 2 out of the 3 offered me a job, I think because I was so tenacious. So I made my own luck in some ways, but that, and my, the concept of putting a couple of hours a week, even though I was doing something that I didn't want, made me focus my attention on getting those jobs. And probably I should have gone just for the personal interviews in the first place. But I did get a job. And it's funny, the one that gave me a job, I had applied for a job for, and they said, Louise, your job application was amazing. And I thought, well, you could have told me that 8 months ago. But don't give up, don't give up. We all get knockbacks, and keep going. And yes, it was lucky that I was single and to be able to do the development course. And then I just thought, look, why don't I just, any job that comes up internationally, I'm just going to take with these guys, because I've just got to build up my repertoire. And that was sort of led to a bit of a crazy life. And then after a while, I was like, no, I really want to target what I do now. But with that experience of a couple of years of craziness, I was then able to target what I do. But it's a good question, because it is partly life experience. There has to be some determination about it, but I think stick with it and think a bit more broad-mindedly about where you go, and use that. Now social networks are a lot better thing, but back then it was without the internet, or wide use of the internet, it was hard to do. So yes, I did have a couple of crazy years. And it's harder when you've got a family, but sometimes you can go and live and work overseas and stay there with a family. And I know some of my colleagues who've done that, and the kids love it. They love it. That's a fantastic opportunity too, especially with some of the international engineering companies. They'll post you over there. Yeah. Some of these organizations look a bit widely about that as well. Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Thanks.
Thank you, Louise. Any other questions? Maybe I can ask one as it comes. Gilbert has come. Gilbert, go ahead.
I suppose it's kind of related to the previous question, but I sometimes sort of hear about people's careers and they sound really great and freewheeling, and I sometimes wonder whether that's still maybe possible now. And and I think of sort of shifts in employment practices, sort of the
Yeah.
drive to become more objective, like hiring practices are often sort of based on how much you score against certain requirements. And I wondered whether maybe I'm perceiving that wrong. Is there a different way that if you want to have a sort of freewheeling career and sort of move into areas that seem slightly unpredictable, how do you sell yourself? Or maybe am I wrong? Is it still possible to pitch yourself outside of the lines of where you might be put into a box?
I think it is possible. I mean, I haven't had to apply for a job during COVID, but I think a lot of what it's how you sell yourself. Certainly on my CV, I haven't just put down technical skills, I've put personal skills. I put on, look, you've got to have a sense of humor in what I do because otherwise you'd go crazy. I've put on that I've worked with people from different cultures because I think that's important. And I've put on some things that I've done in projects. But to get into it in the first place, yes, I'd worked for an NGO for a while, setting up that marine reserve, and I'd done planning. But I was trying to think of things that would help that had a development slant, even if they were UK based. So the reason I give that regeneration thing is it's not a bad idea because it was sort of trying to unlock poverty from a whole lot of different angles, you know, from a social perspective, from a physical perspective, and from an economic perspective. So I think if you can think a bit more widely about how you apply your experience, people like that. And I know that a lot of the management consultants these days are taking a different perspective, like Ernst & Young, Deloitte, are now promoting the fact that they're not even looking where people studied because they were finding that they were getting a certain cohort that's, sorry, a bit white privileged, dare I say it, and they weren't getting a good cross-section of people that could give them a different perspective. And so I think things have changed a little bit, but sometimes you don't think to look in an organization if they're looking for somebody that might have your skills. Yeah. And if it's possible, maybe do some voluntary work somewhere because that still counts. Yeah. Or sometimes it's a bit harder. I took on a guy because he said, I'll come and work for you for free for 3 months. And I was like, sounds like a bargain. And he's had a great career in that. So, you know, even if it's just saying, can I shadow you or something like that? I know it's hard with employment law in the UK and we've got to give you funds and hopefully post-COVID we'll be able to do that. But try and get those sorts of networks that enable you to do that. And really, you've got to think more carefully about the CV. Sometimes the CVs I get, I'm just, you know, I'm like, you've just listed your jobs. You haven't said what you've done. You haven't listed what other perspective. Just try and think outside the box a little bit for what your experience is in it. Problem solving in a practical way, facilitation of really different views. You know, it might be, look, it took us 3 months to solve a problem, but it took that long to actually get people to talk the same language. And that sort of skill is useful anywhere. Yeah. So as I said, think a bit more widely about who you apply for, what you say in your CV. And yes, it'll be point scoring, but if you've got a slightly different perspective, then do it. And if you get an opportunity where you can go in and just even sit somewhere for a week, take it. Take it. A week of your life for 30 years career, why not, you know?
Thank you, Louise. You'll have them all coming to shadow you and volunteer.
I'm working at home at the moment. If you can do some DIY, I'd be very
in your
grateful.
garden, a queue of people waiting outside your door to shadow you. I would love to shadow you, Louise.
Well, some of the stuff I do is routine and some of it's really interesting. But, you know, as I said, I just want you to think a bit more differently about who you could work for. And I'm not sure everybody gives you that perspective. Certainly nobody told me. It was just stumbled sort of across it, although as it's turned out, it fitted my skill set and my interest. So I'm a bit more practical person and I like that practical approach in development. I need to write a book about it or summarize some of my projects from that perspective, because I think Sometimes we get the theoretical without the practical.
Absolutely.
Mm.
Any other questions?
I've got a question. How much value would you place on contacting a company directly when you're looking for employment, as opposed to going through like job applications?
I would say, I think you've got a good point there, because what are they saying? They're getting thousands of job applications at the moment. I think, you know, if you approached a company and look them up to see that they actually do work in your interest area. Companies I targeted were those that had overseas offices, that worked overseas and advertised as such, even though, as we say, it was engineering companies. And I approached them directly. I mean, by that stage, I had a name to approach directly. So I think that's not a bad idea, to approach somebody in the organization with a CV, not too long, targeted, and they'll probably get interested, because sometimes, and especially if you say, look, you're interested in part-time work or contract work, as well as full-time, because sometimes they can't offer you full-time work at the moment. So they might say, oh, we need somebody to help us. Do you mind doing this? You probably don't, if it gets you in the door. Yeah, anything to get you in the door and the feet under the table, I think. And then you start to prove your worth. I think that's not a bad idea. And be targeted, and keep your CV the same, but I used to target the letter that I sent to try and to get my foot in the door. And the two opportunities that I took, the one that I worked with one, and then they didn't really offer the international work. And then I went to work with the other engineering firm, and that's where my career took off. So once you make that contact, it's not a bad idea to keep that going. Yeah. But yes, I would suggest that. Some of the bigger organizations are a bit fussy about that. But if you say, look, I'm interested I'm prepared to work contract, that might open the door, because they're a bit nervous of taking somebody on full time.
Thank you.
Adina, is it?
Adina, I think she's speaking.
She's on mute, I think. The catchphrase of 2020 and 2021. I think there was a question popped up in the text box.
Oh, let me think.
Yeah, that was me. I was just going to ask, is there a piece of advice you'd give starting you? Just like one thing that you wish you'd known when you had started off?
Oh, what would it be?
Or more than one, that works too.
Okay. I think it would be to sort of think of what development can be. And it's not just in developing countries or emerging countries. That there's opportunity to get development in all shapes and forms, that it's across the sectors, you know, the environment, the social, the economic, those sorts of things, to think a bit more widely about what you do. And if you've studied something, don't let it limit you with what you can do. Yeah. I got my practical experience by having the opportunity of going working, setting up a marine reserve and scuba diving twice a day. I mean, it was fantastic. But I took that opportunity, yeah. And from that, I was able then to gel everything together. When I started town planning, I didn't think I'd be doing what I'm doing now. But at least it gelled some of my interest areas. So sometimes maybe, dare I use that groovy word, unpack what you did and see why you did something and what's your interest area and how that aligns with development, and see what opportunities that might open with employers. Yeah. And that's often, you know, quite a good experience thing. I can remember working in Guinea in Africa, and there was a girl, and she started off working as a volunteer on the Notting Hill Carnival. Yeah. And she got involved in organizing that. And from that, she able to get herself a job in Deloitte. Yeah. So, you know, that's what I mean about just thinking about an interest area. She did it voluntarily, but because it was a project, it was street related, it was working with different cultures, she was then able to do that, and it got her interested in doing international work. So for me, I wish I'd thought about that when I'm doing town planning. Maybe it was an interest area, as I said, in geography and history, which it combined, but it wasn't till I realized that I liked the environment side and the community side, the other side of development, and got the opportunity to work in Belize, that started to gel to see what I want. So it doesn't matter if you don't get into development, and it takes you a little while to sort out your career. And part of the excitement is using that and then being able to go from this and that, and building up that experience. So yeah, just think about interest areas that you like, that you think that you could, have sort of master. And some of that is then that the autonomy that you get is making the decision to try and follow that. If it doesn't work, move slightly to the left or the right, because I'm sure eventually, once you get in there, you'll be able to it'll open up other doors for you that can help have an interesting career and lots of stories to tell future students of the DPU. I think somebody else put up their hand, wasn't it?
Thank you, Louise. I'm checking. No, not yet.
Okay.
I was wondering, Louise, you who had worked in so many organizations, and you must have come across situations where you don't fully share the beliefs. Can you give us examples of how you managed to navigate the dilemmas between that you're faced in working on projects, especially, when we're talking about mining projects, and so, there's other projects that we're all thinking, oh, let's stay clear, but is there a way of being in it and navigating that?
So this major study done by Goldman Sachs showed that projects failed because of social issues. And it's you can see the nods around the table saying we've got to think not just projects are going to fail from an engineering perspective. So I use that often to indicate the need for thinking a bit more widely about that. And you can come across some really arrogant people, and that's no matter what you do. Very mindset, etc. And it's working on them collectively to for them to start to see that they can think about things differently. And you're trying to achieve the same goal of whether it's a water supply project or employment for the locals. And once they start to get onto that, they actually see that you're not against them, you're working with them. There's a lot of organizations now that have cottoned onto that. But sometimes governments I work with are still a bit stuck in the mud, or dare I say it, there's a lot of corruption. So there's a view with regard to that. They're coming from one perspective. So, sorry, I'm just getting, sorry, can you see me? Sorry.
Yes, I can see you.
So I've found that I've had to navigate some of those views very carefully. And some arrogance, etc. But one of the things as being an international consultant is that I'm not going to lose my life or my family's put under pressure if I say things. And sometimes that's part of your job. But yes, I mean, I've come across a lot of aggression. It used to be on the environment side, now it's on the social side. And it takes a while. You've got to have a bit of backbone to keep standing in there. But once they see that the project's running and the community are helping that, they're turning up for employment, they're helping with security, etc., then it's been really rewarding that there's been benefits inside as well as outside.
Thank you, Louise. Yusra?
Yes, the question I have is I'm a mid-career really, so I'm older than most people on the course, and but I've been thinking of making a career change. I worked already at the start of my career in Africa and Middle East, and Now I'm here in the UK, but my experience is always in the private sector.
Yeah.
And now thinking of what I'm going to do in the future, there is always fear. Like people say, oh, the private sector, it's a different motivation, different mindset. It's going to be a big move, maybe, and you will lose some of your experience. Maybe stay in the private sector and continue doing what you're doing. But I really want to do something different to give me different energy. And so the fear of change.
Yeah.
What advice can you give me?
Well, I was 34 when I came over to do the DPU course, and I graduated when I was 35. And I went for an interview and a guy said, you're too old to change careers. 35. I was just, I'm going to show you. All it did was just give me more resolve. Yeah. And prior to that, I'd worked a bit in the private sector, but I'd also worked in the government sector. And so what I'm saying is that don't be worried if you might have to go back in the private sector, but still keep your opportunities open to see what your opportunities are elsewhere, because sometimes the World Bank, dare I say it, or some of those other organizations are looking exactly for somebody who's come from the private sector. You know, I was talking to Difford and they definitely wanted that person in there because their people in development were too much development speak and not enough about trying to get a project going. Okay, so don't worry about your age. Don't worry that your career's just been private sector. Again, think about what you've done there. And all those people that I know are working in the World Bank now came from the private sector. Okay, came from that. So don't.
That's good news.
Those, the blurring of those different sectors now was really quite interesting, I think, because of the experience that they're after. And also, I think there's been a different perception of private sector latterly because there's more emphasis now on them to do development. Yeah.
Yes, there is. Yeah, they have objectives.
And so I think you've probably got, I only speak Australian and English, embarrassingly. So you've probably got a better language range than me. I'm not sure what your private sector background is, but as I said, don't see anything as a barrier. See it as a skills to share. Yeah. I certainly don't see it, and I certainly don't see age as a barrier either.
Excellent. That's good news.
Yeah. Don't see that. Don't let them make it that. Yeah.
It's not the age really. It's just the fear of losing my experience and not being able to transition my skills. Like most of the skills are direct transfer really, but it's just the mindset of the new organization.
Don't be afraid of change. I've been made redundant twice, and it's the best thing that's ever happened to my career. Okay, I was working contract and they ran out of work, and that's what really pushed me to go and work for that engineering company where launched my international career. And a couple of years ago, I worked for an organization that was, I'm not a man hater, but it was full of men engineers in the oil and gas sector, and they promised me things that didn't deliver. And I left that organization. I have never looked back working for myself. I get on with the boss. All of that. I'm working with guys that I'm old enough to be their mother, which is fine. So don't worry about it. It's only if you think it matters, it doesn't matter. Yeah. It's all of that. A lot of skills in working is getting on with people, and you've got to do that in the private sector, the public sector, the NGO sector, everywhere.
Yep.
So it's mostly about that. I'm sure you'll be fine.
Oh, thank you.
Thank you.
You're getting lots of questions on the chat line, I think.
No, it's just encouragements.
Oh, right, okay.
They all encouragement, because I feel like you really infuse us all with motivation, and you pave the way for this future with all sorts of possibilities, which is fantastic.
Yeah.
Also, it's fantastic to see you guys asking so many questions. It really feels like we are in an intimate room. So thank you for that.
Yeah, it does. Yeah, it does.
Any more questions?
Yeah, I've got another one. Do you have any experience with like environmental investment or like socially responsible investing?
Sort of not as that directly, but I've had a lot of experience working with development finance institutions that want to invest in projects that I'm working on. So very much the social and the ESG side of it, environment and social governance. And I'm starting to look a lot more at that because I think that's something that I could get into in the future. So well, my career is not over yet. So even though a lot of the financial institutions are really looking at that now, they're really looking at things that are undertaken by private sector organizations that actually invest in social investment. So, you know, I've been giving talks on the community development agreements that we've signed in Nigeria. Now, that in itself is not unique. It's the fact that Nigeria requires that by legislation, which I think is brilliant. They've learnt from their oil and gas sector, okay? So they've put it into their mining sector. And I can remember when I first started in that, my boss said, it'll take us about 6 weeks to do this, the CDA, the Community Development Agreement. I said, I think it'll take us about 18 months, which is what it took. But then we were able to get development finance institutions to come and invest in what we're doing, looking at what we did on social, heavily involved in what we were doing on social and environment, yeah, to make sure that we had policies, procedures in place, that we walk the talk. I say, we've promised community employment. Have we delivered that? Yeah. So no matter what, it could be social responsible in itself, but it's often part of a whole now. And there's a huge raft of information at the moment out on ESG, put out by, I'm probably going to offend the lawyers and the bankers online, that really is too lawyered and too bankered rather than impacting on communities. And that's something else I need to think about, of getting some ESG criteria that really matches what happens in the real world. And on the governance side, you know, in where I am in Nigeria, we've got to deal with cultural governance, which there's more respect for than the government itself. So when I bring that up at talks, everybody looks a bit horrified that I'm mentioning that, but that's the reality. Welcome to reality. So it's a really important thing, Rafi, to get into that, because it's definitely a thing of the moment, probably going to grow in significance over the next couple of years. And there's a lot of development finance institutions, normal finance institutions that are Equator principles that are looking for that experience.
That's
I'm not sure if that answered the question.
Thank you, Louise. I think we have come to the end of our session. So I just want to say a fantastic thank you, Louise. And usually at this end, you also give us the business card, which we don't have a chance to get from you. What's the equivalent these days?
Yeah. So I'm on LinkedIn. I can see there's some LinkedIn invites are coming up through now. And that's a good little network. Rita and I were talking about, you know, getting up a DPU sort of past students website or some network to connect, which I think would be fantastic. I've come across people who've studied the DPU accidentally in countries I'm working in, and there's an immediate bond, you know, so I think that would be great to have something like that. But look, I've been in your shoes. I was changing careers when I went to the DPU, and it didn't happen immediately, but I got there. So it's nice to come back and talk to you about it, to show that there is hope and that there's other opportunities out there, and really interesting, exciting and rewarding career and life outside of that.
Thank you, Louise. And with that, can I ask you all to unmute yourself, and let's give a round of applause to Louise for this hour with us.
Thank you, Louise.
Thank
Thank
you so
you
much.
so much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you so much.
Okay,
Thank you. Have a nice
you.
day.
Bye.
Okay.
Thank you
Bye-bye.
all.
Thank you.
Have a nice day.